The annals of human history are written with the blood of conquerors and the tears of the conquered. From the dawn of civilization, the earth has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the shattering of kingdoms, and the relentless march of ambitious men who sought to hold the world in the palm of their hands. Men like Pharaoh, Nimrod, and the Caesars built monuments to their own arrogance, declaring themselves gods among mortals. They sought absolute power, and in their pursuit, they left behind trails of ash and ruin. But buried deep within the sacred texts, hidden beneath the sands of time and the veils of ancient mystery, lies the story of a conqueror unlike any other. This is not the story of a tyrant driven by ego or a warlord thirsty for gold. This is the epic of a man to whom the Creator gave absolute dominion over the earth, stretching from the farthest horizons of the setting sun to the untamed edges of its rising. A king whose kingdom was bound not by cruelty, but by divine justice. A traveler of dimensions, a master of unseen technologies, and the architect of the greatest barrier ever constructed by human hands. His real name is lost to the echoes of antiquity. The sacred texts refer to him by a title that has sparked debate among scholars, mystics, and historians for thousands of years: Dhul-Qarnayn, the possessor of the two horns. What does this enigmatic title truly mean? Some ancient scholars believed it referred to the physical horns on a helm he wore into battle, striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. Others speculated it meant he ruled over the two horns of the earth, the absolute east and the absolute west. Mystics suggested it was a metaphor for a man who straddled two epochs, two dimensions, or the physical and the spiritual realms simultaneously. Whoever he was, one truth remains absolute: his power was unmatched in human history. The divine revelation states, "Indeed, we established him upon the earth, and we gave him to everything away." Consider the terrifying magnitude of that statement. We gave him to everything away. This was not merely an abundance of swords and shields. Dhul-Qarnayn was granted access to the underlying mechanics of the world. He possessed an intellect that could unravel the mysteries of engineering, geography, astronomy, and metallurgy. He understood the pathways of the mountains, the currents of the oceans, and the alignments of the stars. His army was not a mindless horde of mercenaries, it was a moving civilization. It comprised not only elite, unbreakable warriors but also master architects, brilliant scholars, seasoned explorers, and spiritual guides. When Dhul-Qarnayn marched, the earth trembled beneath the weight of an unprecedented, divinely guided superpower. Yet, the true miracle of Dhul-Qarnayn was not his military might, but the state of his heart. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, or so the earthly proverb goes. When a man is given the ability to take whatever he desires, to crush anyone who stands in his path, the darkness within the human soul usually consumes him. But Dhul-Qarnayn was incorruptible. He wore his crown with the humility of a servant. He understood that his vast empire, his advanced knowledge, and his unstoppable armies were not products of his own greatness, but tools loaned to him by the King of Kings. His mission was not to enslave humanity, but to establish divine order, to protect the weak from the oppressors, and to illuminate the darkest corners of the globe with the light of justice. He was the sword of truth in a world drowning in chaos. His epic saga begins with a call to the unknown. The Creator inspired him to initiate a journey that would push the limits of human endurance. He gathered his colossal army, a sea of banners and armor that stretched to the horizon, and set his sights on the farthest edge of the Western world. He marched toward the setting place of the sun. The logistics of such a campaign are staggering to the modern mind. Imagine an army of hundreds of thousands crossing unmapped continents, traversing scorching deserts, navigating treacherous mountain passes, and forging paths through dense, primeval forests. They moved through lands inhabited by diverse tribes and ancient nations, some of whom had never seen a unified army, let alone an empire of this scale. Where lesser conquerors would have pillaged and burned to sustain their troops, Dhul-Qarnayn established order. He brought law to the lawless, civilization to the savage, and mercy to the defeated. His march was a relentless wave of justice sweeping across the face of the earth. Months turned into years as the great expedition pushed ever westward. They marched until there was no more land left to conquer, until the earth finally gave way to the vast, churning expanse of the uncharted ocean. They had reached the absolute edge of the known world. It was here, at the twilight of the earth, that Dhul-Qarnayn witnessed a cosmic spectacle described in the sacred texts with breathtaking, cinematic atmosphere. Until, when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it setting in a spring of dark mud. Picture this awe-inspiring scene. The greatest king on earth stands at the edge of a jagged, towering cliff, his cape billowing in the fierce oceanic winds. Below him lies a vast, murky body of water, perhaps a volcanic caldera near the ocean, or a massive, dark, churning sea where the water runs thick with black sediment and geothermal heat. As the sun begins its descent, the optical illusion is profound and terrifying. The massive, fiery orb of the sun does not just dip below the horizon. It appears to be swallowed whole by the boiling, dark, muddy spring. The sky bleeds into hues of deep crimson, bruised purple and pitch black. The world is plunged into an eerie, suffocating twilight. It is a place that feels like the end of existence itself, a liminal space between the world of the living and the realm of shadows. But the mystery of the dark spring was not the only discovery waiting for him at the edge of the world. Dwelling in the shadows of this twilight land was a nation of people. The ancient texts do not give us their name, but they describe a society that was entirely at the mercy of the two-horned king. They were a people who perhaps lived by their own savage rules, cut off from the light of divine guidance. Dhul-Qarnayn's immense army surrounded them, their polished armor reflecting the last dying rays of the sun. The fate of an entire nation rested on a single nod from the king. It was at this critical juncture that the Creator spoke to Dhul-Qarnayn, presenting him with a profound psychological and spiritual test. The divine voice echoed in his heart, "O Dhul-Qarnayn, you may either punish them or adopt among them a way of goodness." This was the ultimate test of absolute power. The Creator handed him a blank check. He had the divine authorization to obliterate this nation, to enslave them, to wipe their memory from the face of the earth, or to show mercy. How many conquerors throughout history, when given such unchecked authority, would have hesitated to bathe their swords in blood? How many would have rationalized a massacre in the name of empire building? But Dhul-Qarnayn's response echoed through the heavens, cementing his legacy as the paragon of righteous leadership. Standing before his army and the terrified nation, he declared his law, a law not based on his own whims, but on absolute, unwavering divine justice. He announced, "As for one who does wrong, we will punish him. Then he will be returned to his Lord, and he will punish him with a terrible punishment. But as for one who believes and does righteousness, he will have a reward of paradise, and we will speak to him from our command with ease." With these words, he laid down the foundation of a perfect civilization. He rejected the concept of collective punishment. He refused to be a tyrant. Instead, he established a system where a person was judged solely by their actions. The oppressors, the wicked, and the corrupt would face the swift and heavy hand of earthly justice, followed by the ultimate reckoning in the afterlife. But the righteous, the peaceful, and the good would find safety, honor, and ease under his protection. He did not force them into submission through terror. He offered them a pathway to salvation through justice. Dhul-Qarnayn stayed with this people at the dark spring until he had established a functioning society. He taught them, he structured their laws, and he left them better than he found them. He proved that true power is not the ability to destroy, but the capacity to build, to heal, and to guide. But the mission of the two-horned king was far from over. He had touched the western edge of the world and witnessed the sun sinking into the murky abyss. He had brought light to the twilight. Yet, the vast expanse of the earth still called to him. The divine mandate that propelled him forward allowed for no rest. He was the traveler of the epics, the man who possessed the means to reach the unreachable. As the new dawn broke over the newly stabilized western lands, Dhul-Qarnayn turned his gaze away from the dark ocean. He raised his hand, signaling the commanders of his monumental army. The drums of the march began to beat once more, a deep, rhythmic thunder that shook the ground. The banners were raised, pointing toward a new horizon. He had seen where the sun dies. Now he would march to the very place where the sun is born. He would travel to the absolute east, across unimaginable distances, to face a people who lived under the naked, scorching wrath of a sun with no veil. The journey into the rising light was about to begin, and the mysteries that awaited him there would test not only his power but his compassion. But even that would merely be a prelude to his final destination, a place between two towering mountains, where a terror named Gog and Magog clawed at the foundations of the world, waiting to be unleashed. The saga of Dhul-Qarnayn was only just beginning. The march from the absolute west to the absolute east is not merely a geographic journey. It is a transition between two extremes of human existence. Having stabilized the lands of the setting sun, where the twilight bled into the murky abyss of the dark spring, Dhul-Qarnayn, the possessor of the two horns, turned his gaze toward the dawn. The divine mandate that fueled his unparalleled empire allowed for no stagnation. He was the traveler of the epics, the instrument of divine will, and his task was to weave the fractured corners of the earth into a tapestry of justice. Imagine the sheer, terrifying logistics of this pivot. A monumental army, hundreds of thousands strong, shifting its momentum across the face of the ancient world. This was not a mindless horde, but a highly disciplined, moving civilization. There were legions of heavy infantry whose armor gleamed like a river of steel, cavalry that moved with the synchronized grace of a breaking storm, and supply trains so massive they resembled migrating cities. Alongside the warriors marched the architects, the scholars, the metallurgists, and the spiritual guides. When the drums of Dhul-Qarnayn beat the order to march eastward, the sound echoed through the valleys like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The banners were raised, snapping in the wind, pointing toward the birthplace of the light. The journey was an agonizing test of endurance that spanned untold distances and shifting epochs. They crossed landscapes that would have broken lesser men. They traversed primeval forests where the canopy was so thick that noon looked like midnight. They navigated jagged mountain ranges whose peaks pierced the clouds, where the air was thin and the cold bit into the marrow of their bones. They crossed vast, rolling steppes and waded through roaring rivers that had never been mapped by human cartographers. Months bled into years and years perhaps into decades. Yet the army of Dhul-Qarnayn did not falter. They were sustained by the incorruptible justice of their leader and the unseen hand of the Creator, who had promised, "We gave him to everything away." As they pushed relentlessly eastward, the environment began to undergo a radical and sinister transformation. The lush greens of the central continents slowly surrendered to the pale yellows and burnt oranges of arid plains. The rivers became scarce, and the forests dwindled into isolated patches of scrub brush. Soon even the scrub brush vanished. The air grew terrifyingly dry, stripping the moisture from the soldiers' lungs with every breath. The ground beneath their boots turned from fertile soil to cracked clay, and finally, to a fine blistering sand that offered no resistance and no relief. They were approaching the eastern edge of the world, and the climate was becoming weaponized. The temperature soared to levels that defied human comprehension. The armor of the soldiers, which had once been a symbol of their invincibility, now became a suffocating cage of superheated metal. They were forced to adapt, discarding heavy plates for lighter linens, wrapping their faces to protect against the searing winds. But still Dhul-Qarnayn pushed them forward. He rode at the vanguard, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unaffected by the brutal conditions, driven by a purpose that transcended physical exhaustion. Finally, the landscape flattened entirely. The mountains, which usually provided the earth with shadows and valleys, ceased to exist. The world became a monolithic, featureless plain of baked earth and shimmering heat waves. There were no trees, no clouds, no hills, and no refuge. They had reached the zenith of the east. It was here, at the absolute extremity of the sunrise, that Dhul-Qarnayn witnessed a reality as awe-inspiring and terrifying as the dark spring of the west. The sacred texts describe this encounter with a chilling brevity that demands profound reflection. Until, when he came to the rising of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom we had not made against it any shield. To understand the gravity of this statement, one must strip away the comforts of modern civilization. We live in a world of architecture, of roofs and walls, of climate control and shaded groves. We take for granted the atmosphere, the clouds, and the ozone layer that filter the lethal radiation of our star. But at the edge of the east, Dhul-Qarnayn found a place where the veil between the earth and the sun had been violently torn away. Picture the dawn in this forsaken land. As the earth rotated to face the morning, there was no gentle twilight, no soft gradient of colors painting the sky. The sunrise was a sudden, violent explosion of blinding light and radiating heat. The sun did not merely rise, it struck the earth like a celestial hammer hitting a cosmic anvil. The sky was an unforgiving, bleached white, devoid of a single cloud to offer respite. The light was so intense that it bleached the color from the ground, turning the world into a glaring, overexposed nightmare. And living in the epicenter of this solar crucible was a nation. Who were these people? The ancient commentators and historical mystics suggest they were a primitive, indigenous tribe entirely exposed to the unyielding wrath of the elements. Because the terrain was completely flat and the earth yielded no materials for construction. No timber, no massive stones, no foliage, they had absolutely no architectural defenses. We had not made against it any shield. They possessed no clothing to drape over their scorched bodies, no tents to pitch against the wind, and no natural caves to retreat into. Their existence was a brutal, primal rhythm dictated entirely by the movement of the sun. When the dawn broke, the heat was so instantaneous and lethal that they could not remain on the surface. Some ancient traditions say they would plunge themselves into subterranean bodies of water, rivers that ran deep underground, or they would frantically burrow into the loose, sandy earth like desperate animals, hiding in shallow, suffocating burrows until the sun completed its arc across the sky. Only when the evening brought the temporary mercy of darkness would they emerge, their skin baked and blistered, to scavenge for whatever sparse sustenance the barren earth offered. They lived in a state of perpetual terror, not of a human enemy, but of the very star that gave the world life. When Dhul-Qarnayn's massive, disciplined army arrived, the contrast was jarring. On one side stood the pinnacle of human achievement, an army possessing the highest technology, sophisticated logistics, and unmatched military might. On the other side lay a people reduced to the most basic, humiliating struggle for survival, stripped of dignity by the sheer hostility of their environment. For a lesser conqueror, this would have been an opportunity for exploitation or, at best, a reason for cruel amusement. A tyrant would have seen these vulnerable, naked people as subhuman, perfect candidates for the slave markets of distant empires. A warlord would have driven them from their miserable burrows, forcing them to mine the earth or serve as fodder for his campaigns. But Dhul-Qarnayn was not a tyrant. He was the embodiment of divine justice and mercy. The Quran captures his profound understanding and the divine endorsement of his mission with a majestic verse. Thus, "And we had encompassed all that he had in knowledge." The Creator knew the purity of Dhul-Qarnayn's intentions. The king looked upon this scorched, desperate nation not with disgust, but with a deep, aching compassion. He saw fellow human beings, creations of the same God, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. He recognized that his divine mandate to establish order and justice was not limited to punishing oppressors. It extended to protecting the vulnerable from the tyranny of nature itself. He halted his colossal army. The banners were lowered and the war drums were silenced. Dhul-Qarnayn dismounted and walked among the people of the sun. Though they spoke no common language, the universal language of mercy required no translation. He did not bring out the swords, he brought out the engineers, the architects, and the scholars. He commanded his vast resources to be deployed not for conquest, but for salvation. The precise nature of his intervention remains one of the beautiful mysteries of the text, but given his title as a master of means and technology, the implications are profound. He taught them the rudiments of civilization. Perhaps his engineers discovered subterranean rock formations and taught the people how to carve deep, cool, permanent dwellings into the earth, providing them with a sanctuary from the lethal rays. Perhaps his metallurgists and weavers utilized the resources brought by the army to construct massive, reflective canopies, vast tents that created artificial shade over their communities. He may have taught them how to dig deep wells, bringing the hidden, cool waters of the earth to the surface, transforming their desperate, animalistic survival into a dignified human existence. He clothed them. He organized them. He imparted the knowledge of the divine, teaching them that the sun they feared was not an angry god to be appeased, but a creation of the most merciful, subject to the same laws of the universe as they were. He established order, implemented laws of fairness, and elevated their status from victims of the environment to masters of their own destiny. Dhul-Qarnayn did not demand tribute from them. He did not ask for their gold, their crops, or their servitude. He expected no earthly reward for his monumental efforts. His reward was the fulfillment of his divine duty. He stayed with the people of the East until their society was stabilized, until the children no longer feared the dawn, and the elders could rest in the cool shade of their new sanctuaries. But the world was vast, and the journey of the two-horned king was still incomplete. He had touched the absolute west, where the sun drowned in darkness, and he had reached the absolute east, where the sun ruled with unyielding fury. In both extremes he had established justice, leaving behind a legacy of light and mercy. Yet there was a third direction calling to him. A path that lay neither in the extreme west nor the extreme east, but on a different axis entirely. As the newly shielded people of the east looked upon their savior with tears of gratitude, Dhul-Qarnayn raised his hand. The engineers packed their tools, the infantry reformed their ranks, the cavalry mounted their steeds. The deep, rhythmic thumping of the war drums began to echo across the plains once more. The king turned his horse away from the rising sun. He was now embarking on the most dangerous and consequential leg of his journey. He was heading towards a treacherous pass situated between two insurmountable mountain ranges. He was marching toward an encounter with a people whose language could barely be understood, who lived in the shadow of a terror so profound that it threatened to consume the entire world. He was marching toward the domain of Gog and Magog, Yajooj and Majooj. The true test of his architectural genius, his military might, and his divine mandate was about to begin. He had protected people from human oppressors and from the wrath of the sun, but now he would have to build a barrier to protect the world itself from an apocalyptic swarm. The epic of the Iron Wall was approaching. The journey of Dhul-Qarnayn, the possessor of the two horns, had already transcended the limits of conventional human achievement. He had marched his colossal invincible army to the absolute edge of the west, where the sun drowned in a murky abyss, establishing justice in the twilight. He had traversed the breadth of the earth to the absolute east, where the sun scourged the barren plains with unshielded fury, bringing the mercy of civilization to a people naked against the wrath of the sky. By any standard of history, his legacy as the greatest conqueror and lawgiver was eternally secured. He could have turned his vast, migrating civilization back toward the center of the world to bask in the glory of his unparalleled empire. But the divine mandate that beat within his chest allowed for no rest. He was not merely a king, he was the instrument of the Creator's will upon the earth. As the newly protected people of the East watched with tears of profound gratitude, the great king turned his horse away from the rising sun. He raised his hand and the deep, rhythmic, earth-shattering thud of the war drums began once more. The banners were hoisted into the wind. The vast legions of infantry, the swift cavalry, the master architects, and the supply trains that rivaled entire cities pivoted toward a new horizon. They were now marching on a third axis, venturing into a territory that lay neither in the extreme west nor the extreme east, but deep into a treacherous, uncharted frontier. The environment began to change drastically as they advanced. The blistering heat of the eastern plains gave way to a chilling, biting wind. The flat terrain began to buckle and fold, rising into jagged, intimidating hills that eventually swelled into colossal mountain ranges. The sky, which had been a harsh, glaring white, became choked with heavy, ominous clouds that draped the world in perpetual, suffocating shadows. The air grew thin, and the sheer silence of the landscape felt heavy, pregnant with a sense of impending doom. Finally, the vast army came to a halt. Before them lay a geographical anomaly of terrifying proportions. The sacred texts refer to it simply as between the two mountains, as Sadain. Imagine two towering, insurmountable peaks, their summits lost in the swirling clouds, their faces composed of sheer, unforgiving rock. Between these two monolithic titans lay a deep, narrow gorge, a natural bottleneck, a chasm that served as a dark, foreboding gateway between the known world and a realm of absolute nightmares. Dwelling in the shadows of this colossal mountain pass was a nation of people. When Dhul-Qarnayn and his vanguard approached them, they encountered a barrier more difficult to cross than any desert or ocean, the barrier of profound isolation. The revelation describes them as a people who could hardly understand a word. This was not a matter of mere dialect. Dhul-Qarnayn commanded an empire that spanned the globe. His ranks undoubtedly included the greatest linguists, translators, and scholars of the age. Yet, the language of this isolated tribe was so alien, so structurally detached from the linguistic trees of the known world, that communication was nearly impossible. But beyond their incomprehensible speech, their most defining characteristic was their collective trauma. Imagine looking into the eyes of these people. You would not see the curiosity or the guarded pride of a sovereign nation. You would see the hollow, haunted stare of the perpetually hunted. They were a people living on the edge of an abyss, their entire existence defined by the paralyzing terror of what lay beyond the mountain pass. Through a painstaking process of gestures, broken translations, and the universal language of human desperation, they managed to convey their horrific reality to the two-horned king. Beyond the two mountains lived a force that defied the conventions of warfare. It was not a rival kingdom. It was not a civilized army seeking territory, resources, or political dominance. It was an apocalyptic swarm, a chaotic, devouring plague in human form. The ancient texts give them a name that has echoed through the corridors of eschatology for millennia. Yajooj and Majooj, Gog and Magog. Who were Gog and Magog? The descriptions passed down through prophetic traditions and historical texts paint a picture of a race characterized by overwhelming numbers, ravenous consumption, and absolute, mindless destruction. They were described as having wide faces, small eyes, and hair with a reddish tinge, moving with a chaotic, unyielding frenzy. When they surged through the mountain pass, they did not fight battles. They executed a total ruination of the earth. The people of the gorge desperately tried to explain the aftermath of a raid by Gog and Magog. They described how the swarm would pour through the chasm like a dark, boiling river of flesh and steel. They consumed everything in their path. They would drink the rivers dry, leaving nothing but cracked mud where life-giving water once flowed. They stripped the forests, devoured the crops, slaughtered the livestock, and massacred anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. They left behind a landscape that looked as though it had been scoured by a demonic fire. And the most terrifying aspect of Gog and Magog was that they could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or permanently defeated. They were a parasitic force of nature, a corruption upon the earth, waiting behind the mountains, growing in number, preparing for their next catastrophic surge. The people living at the mouth of the gorge were broken. They fell before Dhul-Qarnayn, looking at his massive army, his advanced weaponry, and his regal bearing. They saw in him their only hope for salvation. In their desperation, they made a proposal that revealed the depth of their terror. They offered to pool all their resources, to tax themselves into absolute poverty, to gather all the gold, silver, and wealth they possessed, and offer it to the king as tribute. "O Dhul-Qarnayn," they pleaded, "indeed Gog and Magog are great corruptors in the land. So may we assign for you an expenditure that you might make between us and them a barrier." The journey of Dhul-Qarnayn, the possessor of the two horns, had already transcended the limits of conventional human achievement. He had marched his colossal invincible army to the absolute edge of the west, where the sun drowned in a murky abyss, establishing justice in the twilight. He had traversed the breadth of the earth to the absolute east, where the sun scourged the barren plains with unshielded fury, bringing the mercy of civilization to a people naked against the wrath of the sky. By any standard of history, his legacy as the greatest conqueror and lawgiver was eternally secured. He could have turned his vast, migrating civilization back toward the center of the world to bask in the glory of his unparalleled empire. But the divine mandate that beat within his chest allowed for no rest. He was not merely a king, he was the instrument of the Creator's will upon the earth. As the newly protected people of the East watched with tears of profound gratitude, the great king turned his horse away from the rising sun. He raised his hand, and the deep, rhythmic, earth-shattering thud of the war drums began once more. The banners were hoisted into the wind. The vast legions of infantry, the swift cavalry, the master architects, and the supply trains that rivaled entire cities pivoted toward a new horizon. They were now marching on a third axis, venturing into a territory that lay neither in the extreme west nor the extreme east, but deep into a treacherous, uncharted frontier. The environment began to change drastically as they advanced. The blistering heat of the eastern plains gave way to a chilling, biting wind. The flat terrain began to buckle and fold, rising into jagged, intimidating hills that eventually swelled into colossal mountain ranges. The sky, which had been a harsh, glaring white, became choked with heavy, ominous clouds that draped the world in perpetual, suffocating shadows. The air grew thin, and the sheer silence of the landscape felt heavy, pregnant with a sense of impending doom. Finally, the vast army came to a halt. Before them lay a geographical anomaly of terrifying proportions. The sacred texts refer to it simply as "between the two mountains," as Sadain. Imagine two towering, insurmountable peaks, their summits lost in the swirling clouds, their faces composed of sheer, unforgiving rock. Between these two monolithic titans lay a deep, narrow gorge, a natural bottleneck, a chasm that served as a dark, foreboding gateway between the known world and a realm of absolute nightmares. Dwelling in the shadows of this colossal mountain pass was a nation of people. When Dhul-Qarnayn and his vanguard approached them, they encountered a barrier more difficult to cross than any desert or ocean, the barrier of profound isolation. The revelation describes them as a people who could hardly understand a word. This was not a matter of mere dialect. Dhul-Qarnayn commanded an empire that spanned the globe. His ranks undoubtedly included the greatest linguists, translators, and scholars of the age. Yet, the language of this isolated tribe was so alien, so structurally detached from the linguistic trees of the known world, that communication was nearly impossible. But beyond their incomprehensible speech, their most defining characteristic was their collective trauma. Imagine looking into the eyes of these people. You would not see the curiosity or the guarded pride of a sovereign nation. You would see the hollow, haunted stare of the perpetually hunted. They were a people living on the edge of an abyss, their entire existence defined by the paralyzing terror of what lay beyond the mountain pass. Through a painstaking process of gestures, broken translations, and the universal language of human desperation, they managed to convey their horrific reality to the two-horned king. Beyond the two mountains lived a force that defied the conventions of warfare. It was not a rival kingdom. It was not a civilized army seeking territory, resources, or political dominance. It was an apocalyptic swarm, a chaotic, devouring plague in human form. The ancient texts give them a name that has echoed through the corridors of eschatology for millennia. Yajooj and Majooj, Gog and Magog. Who were Gog and Magog? The descriptions passed down through prophetic traditions and historical texts paint a picture of a race characterized by overwhelming numbers, ravenous consumption, and absolute, mindless destruction. They were described as having wide faces, small eyes, and hair with a reddish tinge, moving with a chaotic, unyielding frenzy. When they surged through the mountain pass, they did not fight battles. They executed a total ruination of the earth. The people of the gorge desperately tried to explain the aftermath of a raid by Gog and Magog. They described how the swarm would pour through the chasm like a dark, boiling river of flesh and steel. They consumed everything in their path. They would drink the rivers dry, leaving nothing but cracked mud where life-giving water once flowed. They stripped the forests, devoured the crops, slaughtered the livestock, and massacred anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. They left behind a landscape that looked as though it had been scoured by a demonic fire. And the most terrifying aspect of Gog and Magog was that they could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or permanently defeated. They were a parasitic force of nature, a corruption upon the earth, waiting behind the mountains, growing in number, preparing for their next catastrophic surge. The people living at the mouth of the gorge were broken. They fell before Dhul-Qarnayn, looking at his massive army, his advanced weaponry, and his regal bearing. They saw in him their only hope for salvation. In their desperation, they made a proposal that revealed the depth of their terror. They offered to pool all their resources, to tax themselves into absolute poverty, to gather all the gold, silver, and wealth they possessed, and offer it to the king as tribute. "O Dhul-Qarnayn," they pleaded, "indeed Gog and Magog are great corruptors in the land. So may we assign for you an expenditure that you might make between us and them a barrier." The people of the pass fell to their knees, weeping with relief. The shadow of terror that had haunted their ancestors for generations was finally lifted. They looked at Dhul-Qarnayn, ready to worship him, ready to declare him a god of the earth for achieving the impossible. But once again, the two-horned king demonstrated the unparalleled purity of his heart. Standing before the monumental iron wall, the greatest physical achievement of his life, he did not boast. He did not demand that his name be carved into the metal. He did not ask for a festival in his honor. He looked up at the towering, silent barrier and uttered a sentence that encapsulated the essence of his existence. "This is a mercy from my Lord." He attributed zero credit to his own genius, his army's strength, or his metallurgical knowledge. He recognized that the iron, the copper, the fire, and the intellect were all provisions from the Creator. The wall was a manifestation of divine mercy, a temporary shield granted to humanity. And then, gazing at the smooth metal surface, Dhul-Qarnayn delivered a chilling prophecy, reminding the world that no human structure is truly eternal. He spoke of the end of days, of the distant, terrifying future when the appointed time would arrive. "But when the promise of my Lord comes, he will make it level, and the promise of my Lord is ever true." He knew that the iron wall was not meant to stand forever. It was a ticking clock. It would hold back the swarm of Gog and Magog for millennia, preserving the balance of the world. But a day was written in the cosmic decree, the day of the promise, when the Creator's command would cause that indestructible alloy to crumble into dust. On that day the barrier will fall, and the chaotic swarm of Gog and Magog will pour forth from every elevated place, signaling the final chapters of human history and the approaching terror of the day of resurrection. But for now the wall stood firm. The mission of the pass was complete. Dhul-Qarnayn, the traveler of the epics, the king of the east and the west, turned his horse once more. The drums beat a rhythm of victory and peace. He rode away into the mists of history, leaving behind a world forever altered by his justice, and a silent, towering wall of iron that stands to this day, guarding the greatest secret of the unseen world. The masterpiece of Dhul-Qarnayn was complete. Between the two towering, insurmountable peaks, a solid, monolithic dam of fused iron and copper stood in absolute, terrifying silence. For the people living in the shadow of the gorge, it was a permanent shield, a guarantee of safety that allowed them to finally build a civilization free from the haunting terror of Gog and Magog. For centuries and then millennia, the world forgot the apocalyptic swarm trapped behind the metal. Empires rose and fell. The Romans, the Persians, the Mongols, and the modern superpowers carved the earth with their ambitions, completely oblivious to the ticking cosmic clock hidden in an uncharted mountain pass. Humanity settled into the illusion of permanence, believing that the earth was entirely conquered and understood. But the possessor of the two horns knew the terrifying truth. When he looked upon the glowing, cooling metal of his greatest creation, he did not declare it eternal. He delivered a chilling prophecy, "This is a mercy from my Lord. But when the promise of my Lord comes, he will make it level, and the promise of my Lord is ever true." The iron wall was never meant to be a permanent solution. It was a divine delay. It was a holding cell for a plague that is destined to be unleashed upon the world during its final, dying breaths. To understand the sheer horror of the apocalypse that awaits, one must first look behind the wall, into the suffocating darkness where Gog and Magog have been trapped for thousands of years. They did not simply sit in the darkness and accept their imprisonment. The prophetic traditions paint a psychological portrait of a horde driven by a relentless, mindless, and parasitic obsession. Every single day since the wall was forged, the vast, unfathomable swarm of Gog and Magog has been clawing, scratching, and digging at the fused iron and copper. They use whatever primitive tools they possess, and when those fail, they use their bare hands, tearing their flesh against the unyielding metal. They dig until the iron grows thin, until they can almost see the faint rays of sunlight piercing through the microscopic cracks. At the end of every exhausting, agonizing day of labor, their leader looks at the weakened barrier and says, "Stop for now. We will break through it tomorrow." But in their absolute arrogance, they fail to utter the singular phrase that acknowledges the sovereignty of the Creator, "Inshallah, if God wills." And because they refuse to submit their will to the divine, they are subjected to a daily, agonizing miracle. Overnight, while the horde sleeps, the Creator restores the iron wall to its original, impenetrable thickness. Every morning, Gog and Magog awake to find their grueling labor entirely erased. The metal is smooth, thick, and unbroken. And yet, driven by a mindless, chaotic frenzy, they begin digging again. Day after day, year after year, century after century. This is the endless cycle of their imprisonment. But a day is written in the cosmic decree when this cycle will be broken. The release of Gog and Magog will not happen in a vacuum. It will occur during the most turbulent, terrifying, and miraculous epoch of human history, the end times. Before the wall crumbles, the earth will have already been pushed to the brink of absolute destruction. The world will have witnessed the rise of the false Messiah, the Dajjal, a charismatic, deceptive tyrant who will conquer the globe through illusions, false miracles, and economic manipulation. Humanity will be pushed to the edge of a spiritual abyss. But in the darkest hour, the true Messiah, Jesus the Son of Mary, S.A., peace be upon him, will descend from the heavens. He will defeat the Dajjal, shatter the illusions of the false world order, and unite the believers. For a brief, beautiful moment, the earth will experience a profound era of peace, justice, and spiritual clarity under the leadership of Jesus. It is precisely at the zenith of this peace that the Creator will issue a command that will echo through the unseen realms. God will reveal to Jesus a terrifying reality: "I have brought forth servants of mine whom no one has the power to fight. So gather my servants safely to Mount Tur." In the distant, uncharted mountain pass, the daily routine of the horde will reach its prophesied climax. After a day of frantic digging, as the sunlight begins to peek through the thinned metal, their leader will give the order to halt. But this time, driven by a divine decree that forces the words from his tongue, he will say, "We will break through tomorrow if God wills." That single, fateful phrase will change the destiny of the universe. When the horde awakens the next morning, the wall will not be restored. The iron and copper will remain paper-thin. With a final, deafening surge of physical force, the apocalyptic swarm will shatter the barrier. The iron wall of Dhul-Qarnayn, which stood for millennia as a silent guardian, will crumble into dust. The dam will burst. The Revelation describes their release with a verse that sends shivers down the spine. Until when Gog and Magog are let loose and they, from every elevated mound, are swarming. Imagine a dam holding back an ocean, suddenly vanishing. The sheer volume of Gog and Magog is incomprehensible to the human mind. The prophetic traditions state that on the day of judgment, out of every 1,000 human beings, 999 will be from Gog and Magog. They are a tidal wave of flesh, a dark, boiling river of chaotic destruction that will pour through the mountain pass and spill over the earth. They will not march in formations. They will swarm like locusts, covering the plains, the valleys, and the mountains. As they surge across the landscape, their consumption will be absolute. They will behave like a parasitic virus unleashed upon a fragile host. They will devour the crops, strip the forests bare, and slaughter any living creature they encounter. When the vanguard of their massive horde reaches the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, a massive body of fresh water, they will begin to drink. By the time the rear of their army passes the same location, they will look at the cracked, dry mud and say, "There used to be water here once." They will drink entire rivers dry. The earth will be scoured, stripped of its resources, and plunged into a suffocating famine. The global human population, utterly defenseless against an enemy of this magnitude, will flee. People will abandon their cities, their fortresses, and their wealth, seeking refuge in deep caves, fortified strongholds, and the highest mountains. Jesus and the believers, following the divine command, will take refuge on Mount Sinai. They will be besieged, trapped on the mountain while the world below them is systematically devoured. The situation will become so desperate, and the famine so severe, that the head of an ox will be considered more valuable to them than 100 dinars of gold. They will suffer in agonizing isolation, listening to the distant, terrifying roar of the swarm ravaging the earth. Meanwhile, Gog and Magog, having consumed the world, will be consumed by their own ultimate arrogance. Finding no more humans to slaughter and no more lands to pillage, they will look up at the heavens. In a display of supreme, blinding hubris, they will draw their bows and fire their arrows into the sky. The Creator, in a profound test of their delusion, will allow their arrows to return to earth stained with blood. When the horde sees the blood-stained arrows falling from the clouds, their leader will declare a terrifying, blasphemous victory: "We have conquered the people of the earth, and we have overcome the inhabitants of the heavens." They will believe themselves to be the undisputed masters of the universe. They will believe that nothing can stop them, that they have killed God Himself. But the Creator does not need an army of angels or a shower of meteors to destroy the arrogant. The arrogance of tyrants is often shattered by the most insignificant of creations. On the besieged Mount Jesus and the believers will reach the absolute limit of their endurance. In the depths of their despair, they will turn their faces to the heavens and pray. It will not be a prayer of words, but a cry of the soul, a desperate plea for divine intervention from the only force that can alter the fabric of reality. God will answer the prayer of the Messiah. He will not send a storm of fire or a devastating earthquake. Instead, He will send a creature so small, so seemingly harmless, that it defies the logic of warfare. God will send the Nagf, a microscopic worm or insect, similar to the parasites that affect the noses of camels and sheep. In the span of a single night, this invisible divine plague will descend upon the billions of Gog and Magog. The tiny worms will infect the necks of the horde. The infection will be instantaneous and lethal. When the sun rises the next morning, the deafening, chaotic roar of the swarm will be replaced by an eerie, absolute silence. Jesus and the believers waiting on the mountain will notice that the terrifying noise from the valleys below has ceased. Cautiously, a volunteer will be sent down the mountain, fully expecting to be torn apart, to investigate the silence. What he will find will be a scene of apocalyptic stillness. The entire uncountable horde of Gog and Magog, the swarm that drank lakes dry and claimed to have conquered heaven, will be dead. They will have fallen as a single man, struck down by a tiny worm. The earth will be completely covered in their corpses. When Jesus and the believers finally descend from the mountain, they will be met with a new, horrifying trial. The earth will be saturated with the rotting bodies of the horde. The stench of billions of decaying corpses will be so overpowering, so putrid, that there will not be a single handspan of land free from their remains or their foul odor. The earth will have been saved from their violence, but it will be dying from their decay. Once again, Jesus and His companions will raise their hands in desperate prayer, asking the Creator to cleanse the world. And once again the heavens will respond. God will send massive birds, described in the traditions as having necks like Bactrian camels. These majestic, celestial scavengers will descend from the sky in numbers that darken the sun. They will pick up the colossal, rotting carcasses of Gog and Magog and carry them away, dropping them into the deepest oceans or a place known only to the divine, purging the land of the physical remains of the plague. But the earth will still be stained with their blood and their stench. To finalize the purification, the Creator will send a miraculous, heavy rain. This rain will fall on every inch of the globe. No city, no tent, and no cave will be shielded from it. It will wash the mountains, the valleys, and the plains, scrubbing the earth until it is left shining like a pristine, polished mirror. The scars of the apocalypse will be washed away, leaving the world completely renewed, baptized by the mercy of the heavens. Then a divine command will be issued to the earth itself: "Bring forth your fruits and restore your blessings." The aftermath of Gog and Magog will be an era of unprecedented, breathtaking abundance. The earth will yield its treasures in ways never seen before. The prophetic traditions describe a time when a single pomegranate will be so massive that a large group of people will be able to eat from it, and they will use its colossal rind as a tent for shade. A single cluster of grapes will be enough to satisfy a whole tribe. A single milking of a camel will suffice a multitude. The venom will be removed from every poisonous creature. A child will be able to put his hand into the mouth of a snake unharmed, and a lion will graze peacefully alongside the sheep. It will be a golden age of absolute peace, justice, and spiritual prosperity, a glimpse of paradise upon the earth, lived under the gentle and righteous rule of Jesus, the Messiah. But this golden age too will eventually pass. Jesus will live out his days, pass away, and be buried by the Muslims. A gentle wind from the south will eventually sweep across the earth, taking the soul of every person who has even a mustard seed of faith in their heart. The earth will be left to the most wicked of humanity, upon whom the final, terrifying blasts of the horn will be blown. The epic saga of Dhul-Qarnayn, the Iron Wall, and the apocalyptic swarm of Gog and Magog is not merely a story of ancient kings and future horrors. It is the ultimate parable of human existence. It teaches us that absolute power can only be maintained through absolute justice. It reminds us that no matter how impenetrable our walls may seem, no matter how advanced our technology becomes, the material world is inherently fragile and temporary. Everything built by human hands will eventually crumble. The only thing that will endure the shattering of the heavens and the earth is the purity of the soul and the mercy of the Creator. The wall is ticking. The swarm is digging. The promise is true. And the great gathering awaits us all.